That'll be a $5,000 fine for the initial violation, plus $200 per day it remained, plus the impound and towing fees, Admiral. The woman's voice was a grating symphony of smug satisfaction and cheap perfume, a sound that could curdle milk from 50 paces. Rules are for everyone, especially those who think they're above them. Her name was Karen Miller, and she stood on my lawn like a conquering warlord, a plus-size empress in a fuchsia tracksuit, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a scepter. Behind her, the tow truck was already halfway down the street, my 25-foot sailboat, the Resolute, chained to its flatbed like a captured beast. The boat wasn't just wood and fiberglass. It was the last project I had started with my wife before she passed, a half-finished vessel filled with half-finished memories. And now it was being hauled away like common refuse from the driveway it had occupied for less than 72 hours. I watched its mast shrink against the perfectly manicured suburban skyline of Harbor's Crest estates, a community I'd chosen for its supposed tranquility, a quiet harbor to drop anchor before my retirement from the Navy in a few years. My fists were clenched so tight the knuckles were white, a pressure I hadn't felt since a tense standoff in the Strait of Hormuz. But on the outside, I was perfectly still. My face a mask of naval discipline honed over 30 years of service. An admiral does not lose his composure on his own lawn. He assesses, he strategizes, and he responds with overwhelming, decisive force. Karen Miller had just declared war, and she had absolutely no idea who she was fighting. This is the moment my quiet life ended and my final command began. If you're tired of bullies in power getting away with it, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and maybe share your own HOA nightmare. You're going to want to see how this battle plays out. Now back to the declaration of war. The story doesn't start with the tow truck, of course. It starts with a dream of peace. After a career spent on the rolling gray expanse of the world's oceans, commanding carrier strike groups and navigating geopolitical minefields, all I wanted was a piece of solid ground that didn't move. My final posting as the commander of the nearby naval station was a blessing, a chance to be home every night. When my realtor showed me the house in Harbor's Crest, it seemed perfect. The lawns were green, the houses were uniform shades of beige and taupe, and the quiet was absolute. It was the epitome of civilian order, a place where the loudest sound was a sprinkler head kicking on at dawn. I signed the mountain of paperwork, including the thick binder of HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, barely glancing at them. In the Navy, regulations are the bedrock of existence. They ensure fairness and order. I naively assumed the same principle applied here. I was wrong. The CCNRs in Harbor's Crest were not a foundation for order. They were a weapon, and Karen Miller wielded it with the precision of a guillotine. I moved in on a Tuesday. I had the boat delivered on a Friday afternoon, carefully placed on a professional-grade trailer at the very top of my driveway, tucked beside the garage. My plan was to have it moved to a storage facility on Monday morning, giving me the weekend to unload my tools and equipment. It was a classic Catalina 25, a good solid coastal cruiser. My wife Sarah had picked it out. We were going to fix it up together, learn the constellations from its deck, and sail it down the intracoastal waterway when I finally hung up my uniform. Her diagnosis came just 3 months later, and the boat became a silent monument in our garage, a future that would never arrive. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to touch it for a year. Moving it here was the first step toward finishing what we started, a promise I intended to keep. It sat in my driveway for exactly 68 hours before Karen and her hired tow truck descended. I never even received a warning, no letter, no knock on the door, just the screech of hydraulics and the smug pronouncement of my sentence from the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. As she stood there, a smirk playing on her lips, she handed me a thick envelope. This contains the official violation notice, the fine schedule, and the contact information for the impound lot, she chirped, her tone dripping with condescending helpfulness. You have 30 days to pay the fines before we place a lien on your property. Welcome to the neighborhood, Admiral. She turned then, her tracksuit swishing with an air of finality, and waddled back toward her own house, a beige castle identical to all the others, except for the garish pink flamingos marching across her lawn. A clear violation, I would later learn, of Section 12, subsection C, regarding lawn ornamentation. The hypocrisy was so blatant, it was almost breathtaking. I stood there on my perfect lawn, the official envelope feeling impossibly heavy in my hand, and watched her go. The air was still, the neighborhood silent again, but the peace was gone. A cold, hard resolve settled into my bones. She had impounded more than a boat. She had taken a piece of my history, a piece of my wife. She had mistaken my desire for quiet for an absence of strength. That was her first tactical error. My name is Admiral John Sterling, and this is the story of how I brought an entire corrupt HOA to its knees. The first step in any engagement is to know your enemy and the terrain. For me, that meant a trip to the impound lot and a deep dive into the battlefield of paperwork she'd left me. The lot was a dusty, sun-bleached purgatory for vehicles on the far side of town, run by a man whose disposition matched the gravel under his boots. Getting the Resolute back cost me nearly $700 in towing and storage fees, a sum I paid under protest, getting a detailed, itemized receipt for every single cent. The attendant grunted, clearly used to dealing with furious people, but my calm unnerved him. I wasn't angry, not outwardly. I was calculating. As I hitched the trailer to my truck, I did a full inspection of the boat. A fresh scratch marred the portside hull, a deep gouge in the gel coat that hadn't been there before. I photographed it from every angle, the metadata on the digital photos providing a timestamp. Evidence. That evening, I didn't turn on the television or pour my customary glass of whiskey. Instead, I cleared my large mahogany desk, a desk that had seen plans for multinational naval exercises and covert operations, and laid out the documents. On the left, the thick binder of the harbor's Crest Estate's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. On the right, the violation notice Karen had so graciously delivered. It was time to dissect the enemy's doctrine. The violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. It cited Article 9, Section 3, parking and storage of vehicles. I turned to the corresponding page in the binder. It stated in dense legalese that no boats, trailers, campers, recreational vehicles, or commercial vehicles could be parked or stored on any property for a period exceeding 24 hours, unless fully enclosed within a garage. It was clear I'd give them that. But then there was the fine, $5,000. I scanned the bylaws for the fine schedule. The maximum allowable fine for a first-time violation of this type was listed as $100. The $200 per day penalty was also pure fiction. The bylaws stipulated a $10 daily penalty after a 10-day grace period for remediation. She hadn't just enforced a rule, she had fabricated the consequences out of thin air, assuming I wouldn't read the fine print. This wasn't enforcement, it was extortion. My next move was to compose a letter. In the military, there is a precise, escalating ladder of communication, and you always start at the lowest rung. My letter was a model of detached professionalism. I addressed it to the Harbor's Crest HOA Board of Directors, Suburban President Karen Miller. I formally stated that my property, a sailboat on a trailer, was wrongfully towed from my private driveway. I cited the discrepancy between the fine levied and the fine schedule outlined in the official bylaws. I included a copy of the impound receipt and a photograph of the damage to the hull, along with 2 estimates for its repair from reputable marine body shops. I requested a full reimbursement for the towing, impound, and repair costs, and the immediate rescission of the fraudulent $5,000 fine. I concluded by formally requesting a hearing before the full HOA board to discuss the matter, as was my right under the association's own governing documents. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested. It was a digital paper trail, an undeniable proof of contact. I expected a response within a week or two, perhaps a chastened letter of apology, a check in the mail, a grudging acknowledgement of an administrative error. I was still operating under the assumption that this was a mistake, a simple case of an overzealous functionary who had overstepped her authority and would be corrected by the system she represented. I was still thinking like a man who believed in systems. I had not yet fully grasped that in Harbor's Crest, Karen Miller was the system. The system was a hammer, and to her, every resident, especially the new one in the corner lot, looked like a nail. My polite professional by-the-book letter was not seen as an attempt at resolution. It was seen as a challenge to her authority. And for a petty tyrant like Karen, a challenge was something to be crushed, not addressed. The official response to my certified letter arrived 10 days later, not in the mail, but taped to my front door. It wasn't an envelope, it was a fusillade. 3 separate violation notices, each printed on lurid pink paper that seemed to vibrate with self-importance. The first was for my lawn. According to the notice, which cited Article 7, Section 2, landscaping and maintenance, my grass was, and I quote, maintained at a height exceeding the regulation 3 inches by approximately 1/4 of an inch in sporadic patches. A fine of $25 per day, retroactive to the previous Friday, was assessed. The second notice concerned my mailbox. Apparently, the specific shade of desert taupe paint on it had faded to an unacceptable degree, deviating from the approved color swatch available for viewing at the community clubhouse on Tuesdays between 10 and 12 a.m. and 11 a.m. This was a $50 fine, plus the cost of repainting by the HOA's approved vendor. The third notice was the most audacious. It was a photograph of my driveway with a small, faint discoloration circled in angry red marker. The notice described it as an unacceptable fluid leak, a violation of rules governing the cleanliness of paved surfaces. It didn't matter that the stain was a watermark from a sprinkler head or that my truck, a meticulously maintained machine, didn't leak a single drop of anything. The fine was $100, plus a demand for professional power washing. The bottom of each notice bore the same pre-printed signature of the Architectural Review Committee, but scrawled next to it in an aggressive looping script was the name Karen Miller, President. There was no mention of my boat, my request for a hearing, or the thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines. This was her answer. It was a declaration that she held all the cards and she would not be questioned. She was burying me in a blizzard of bureaucratic nonsense, a classic tactic of attrition. She assumed I would be overwhelmed, that I would either pay up to make it go away or simply give up. She probably imagined me, the stiff military man, out on my lawn with a ruler, frantically measuring blades of grass. The thought was so absurd it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me. The diplomatic phase was over. This was no longer a dispute, it was a campaign. And you don't win a campaign by reacting to the enemy's moves. You win by seizing the initiative. I took the 3 pink notices and laid them on my desk next to the first one. They were no longer irritants, they were exhibits. Exhibit A, B, C, and D in the case I was now building against her. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to my base. I requested to speak with Lieutenant Commander Eva Rostova of the JAG Corps. Eva was brilliant, a shark in uniform with a mind for legal intricacies that bordered on supernatural. She was the officer you called when you needed a regulation from 1952, found and interpreted by lunchtime. Admiral, her voice was crisp and professional through the phone. How can I help you? Eva, I said, my tone shifting from commander to colleague. I have a personal matter. It's a complex puzzle involving contract law, corporate governance, and a significant level of what I can only describe as weaponized pettiness. I need a second set of eyes, someone who enjoys untangling Gordian knots. This is off the books, a personal favor. There was a pause, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. Eva loved a challenge more than anyone I knew. Consider my curiosity piqued, sir, she replied. Send me the preliminary documents. I'll swing by your residence after hours. That evening, my dining room table, which had hosted dinners for foreign dignitaries, was covered in the detritus of the Harbor's Crest HOA. Bylaws, amendments, financial statements I had downloaded from the HOA's laughably insecure public website, and my collection of pink violation notices. Eva arrived looking sharp in her civilian clothes, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She surveyed the scene, a slow smile spreading across her face. Sir, she said, her eyes gleaming, this looks like fun. For the next 4 hours we worked. I explained the situation, and she listened intently, her fingers drumming on the table. She devoured the bylaws, her eyes scanning the pages with incredible speed, occasionally making a sharp note on a legal pad. She cross-referenced the state's Property Owners Association Act with the HOA's own rules, highlighting inconsistencies and potential illegalities. The fraudulent fine for the boat was just the beginning. The entire penalty structure, she pointed out, seemed to violate state caps on HOA fines. The process for placing a lien was also suspect, requiring a board vote that I was certain had never taken place. "She's running this place like a personal fiefdom," Eva murmured, holding a financial statement up to the light as if looking for a watermark. "But a fiefdom still has to follow the laws of the kingdom." She's gotten sloppy. Cocky. Then she found the first thread. It was a line item in the budget under grounds maintenance, a yearly expenditure of over $100,000. It was by far the HOA's single largest expense. "That seems high for a neighborhood this size," Eva noted. "And it's always paid to the same vendor, Miller's Lawn and Landscape. Any relation?" My blood ran cold. "Her name is Karen Miller." Eva's smile returned, wider this time. "Bingo," she whispered. "Nepotism is ugly, but it's not always illegal. But no-bid contracts of this size usually are, especially if the relationship isn't disclosed. We need to see the meeting minutes where this contract was approved. We need to see the competitive bids." My next step was clear. I drafted another letter, this one far more demanding. Citing the state property code, I made a formal request for access to inspect and copy all official records of the harbor's Crest Estates HOA for the preceding 5 years. This included all meeting minutes, all financial records, all invoices and receipts, all existing contracts, and all correspondence related to violations and architectural reviews. Under state law, they had 10 business days to comply. This was no longer a request for a hearing. This was a demand for unconditional surrender of all intelligence. The ball was in her court, but I was now dictating the shape of the battlefield. The request for records sent a shockwave through Karen's little empire. I received a curt, one-sentence email from the official HOA account 5 days later, stating that my request was under review by the board for relevance and necessity. It was a transparent stalling tactic. Eva had already warned me this would be her likely move. "They're legally obligated to provide them," she had explained over the phone. "The relevance argument is nonsense. The law is on your side. Let her stall. It just adds another count to the list of statutory violations." While Karen was reviewing, I was moving. The second phase of my campaign was to gather human intelligence. I needed to know if I was the only target or just the latest in a long line. I printed out copies of my violation notices, the boat, the grass, the mailbox, and began to take evening walks through the neighborhood, a friendly new resident just getting to know his neighbors. My first stop was the house directly across from me, which belonged to a quiet, elderly widower named Mr. Henderson. He spent most of his days tending a magnificent rose garden that lined his walkway. "Good evening, Ida," I said, leaning on his odds fence. "I'm John Sterling, from across the street." He looked up from his pruning, his eyes wary. In a neighborhood ruled by suspicion, a friendly stranger was an anomaly. "George Henderson," he replied, wiping his brow. I gestured with the papers in my hand. "I'm new to the way things work around here. I was wondering if you'd ever seen notices like these." I showed him the violation for the grass height. A flicker of recognition, and then anger crossed his face. "Her," he muttered, not needing to say the name. "Last spring she tried to make me rip out half my rose bushes. Said they were non-compliant with the neighborhood's aesthetic continuity. My late wife planted those bushes 30 years ago." "What did you do?" I asked. "I told her she'd have to come through me with a backhoe to get to them," he said, a stubborn glint in his eye. "She fined me every day for a month. I just ignored the letters. Eventually she moved on to someone else. She's a predator, you see. She looks for the weak ones, the ones who will scare easily." He was the first soldier in my army. My next visit was to the Rodriguez family, 2 houses down. A young Navy couple, a lieutenant in the aviation wing at my base and his wife, with 2 small children. Their backyard was home to a brightly colored plastic playset. "Admiral Sterling," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, surprised to see me at his door. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Lieutenant. I'm here as your neighbor," I assured him. I showed his wife, Maria, the notices. Her hand went to her mouth. "She's doing it to you too," she whispered. They told me their story. Karen had waged a 6-month war against their playset, claiming it was a temporary structure not permitted by the bylaws. She fined them until they were on the brink of financial ruin, threatening a lien that would have jeopardized the security clearance the lieutenant needed for his job. They finally capitulated, spending thousands of dollars to have a custom, HOA-approved wooden structure built by, to their astonishment, Miller's Lawn and Landscape. The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about power, it was a racket. Karen wasn't just a bully, she was a racketeer, using the HOA as her personal ATM and enforcement arm. On the 10th business day after my records request, a large manila envelope appeared on my doorstep. It contained a curated selection of documents, heavily redacted meeting minutes, a summary budget statement instead of the detailed financials I'd requested, and a letter from Karen. The letter stated that the board had deemed my request overly broad and burdensome, but had provided these documents as a courtesy. Any further requests would need to be submitted in writing for a 30-day review period. She was building a paper wall. It was time to bring in the engineers. I took the packet straight to Eva. We met in a small conference room on the base, the official seal of the U.S. Navy on the wall behind us. She laid the redacted documents out, her expression turning from curiosity to cold fury. "This is a flagrant violation of the statute," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "She's not just denying you access. She's actively concealing information. This is no longer a civil matter, Admiral. This is evidence of potential fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." Eva drafted a second letter for me, this one on the letterhead of a civilian attorney she knew, a retired JAG officer who owed her a favor. The tone was no longer polite. It cited the specific state statutes Karen was violating by withholding the records. It stated that if the complete, unredacted records were not made available for inspection within 72 hours, we would file a motion to compel in district court, and we would be seeking not only the records but all associated legal fees and punitive damages. We were done asking. The letter was a torpedo in the water. For 2 days there was silence. I continued my walks, gathering more stories, more allies. The young couple who were fined for having their garage door open for more than an hour. The retired school teacher who was forced to repaint her front door because the shade of red was too vibrant. The pattern was undeniable. Karen and her silent, complicit board members, a vice president who was her best friend, and a treasurer who was her brother-in-law's golfing buddy, ruled through fear and intimidation. On the 3rd day, I received an email. It was from Karen. "The records you requested are available for inspection in the community clubhouse. Please schedule an appointment. You will be allotted 2 hours and may not bring any electronic devices, including cameras or phones." It was a last-ditch effort to control the situation, to make the process as difficult as possible. She didn't know I was bringing a weapon more powerful than any camera. I was bringing Lieutenant Commander Eva Rostova, who had a photographic memory. We scheduled the appointment for the following afternoon. The war for information was over. The battle for justice was about to begin. The community clubhouse smelled of stale coffee and industrial-strength air freshener, a scent I now associated with bureaucratic oppression. Karen sat behind a folding table, flanked by her 2 board cronies, a woman with a severe haircut who must be the vice president, and a man with a perpetually nervous expression who I assumed was the treasurer. They looked like a tribunal for a minor traffic violation. Piled on the table were 3 cardboard banker's boxes, overflowing with files and binders. Karen gestured to them with a magnanimous sweep of her hand. "As requested," she said, her voice oozing false compliance. "You have 2 hours, no phones. You may take notes with the provided paper and pen." The pen was a cheap, non-clicking ballpoint, the kind that dies after 5 sentences. The paper was a small stack of loose-leaf sheets. The message was clear. "I'm following the letter of the law, but I will make this impossible for you." She had severely underestimated my preparation. "Thank you, Karen," I said calmly. "This is my associate Eva. She'll be assisting me." Eva gave them a nod so sharp it could have cut glass. We sat down and opened the first box. It was a chaotic mess of invoices, receipts, and correspondence, deliberately disorganized to slow us down. But chaos is my element. I've managed flight deck operations during a typhoon. A box of papers was nothing. I took one box, Eva took another, and we began to work in silence. I focused on contracts and invoices, specifically anything from Miller's Lawn and landscape. Eva focused on meeting minutes and financial reports. Karen and her acolytes watched us, their smug expressions slowly fading as they witnessed the sheer efficiency of our operation. We weren't reading, we were scanning, processing, identifying. Eva's mind was a human scanner, absorbing pages of text and numbers, her pen flying across her notepad in a cryptic shorthand only she understood. I stacked the Miller landscape invoices into a neat pile, noting the dates, the amounts, and the descriptions of work. The pattern was glaring. Dozens of invoices for tree trimming, mulch delivery, and seasonal planting, many of them for amounts just under $5,000, a common threshold that might trigger extra scrutiny. More damningly, I found multiple invoices for the same work on the same day, effectively splitting a larger bill into smaller, less conspicuous ones. It was a classic amateurish attempt to circumvent financial controls. After about an hour, Eva looked up, a glint in her eye. "Found it," she mouthed silently. She slid a binder across the table to me. It was the meeting minutes from 4 years ago. I flipped to the date she had marked. The minutes recorded the vote to award the community's new 5-year landscaping contract. According to the document, 3 bids were considered. Miller's Lawn and Landscape was awarded the contract based on their competitive pricing and local reputation. The vote was recorded as unanimous. The treasurer, the nervous man sitting right across from us, had seconded the motion. There was no mention of the fact that the company was owned by Karen Miller's brother-in-law. There was no disclosure of the familial relationship. That single omission was the legal linchpin we needed. It was malfeasance, a clear breach of her fiduciary duty to the association. The rest of the fraud would cascade from that single point of failure. We used every second of our allotted 2 hours. By the end, Eva had filled her legal pad with notes, and I had a mental map of their entire corrupt enterprise. We stood up, our faces betraying nothing. "Thank you for your time," I said, my voice even. "This has been very illuminating." Karen, who had expected us to leave frustrated and empty-handed, was visibly flustered. "Is that all?" she asked, a hint of desperation in her voice. "For now," I replied. We walked out of the clubhouse and into the bright afternoon sun. We didn't speak until we were back in my truck. "She's not just a bully, she's a thief," I said, the words tasting like ash. "And her board is complicit." "They're all on the hook," Eva confirmed. "Breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to defraud, and based on those invoices, I'd say there's a strong case for embezzlement. She's been using HOA funds as her family's personal piggy bank." The evidence was now secure, not on paper but in our minds and on Eva's notepad. The next step was to transform that evidence into a weapon the entire community could wield. We needed to rally the troops. That weekend, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue at my house. I invited everyone I had spoken to, Mr. Henderson, the Rodriguez family, the couple with the garage door issue, the teacher with the red door, and told them to invite anyone else who had a story to share about the HOA. By Saturday afternoon, my backyard was filled with nearly 30 people, a cross-section of the community, all bound by a shared sense of grievance. They mingled awkwardly at first, sharing quiet complaints in hushed tones. I let them talk for a while, letting the collective frustration build. Then I stood on my back deck and called for their attention. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know why you're here. You're here because of a fine, a threat, a letter on your door. You're here because you've been made to feel powerless in your own homes." I looked around the yard, meeting their eyes. "I'm here to tell you that you are not powerless. For the past few weeks, I've been conducting an investigation into our HOA's leadership, and what I've found is worse than any of us imagined." For the next 30 minutes, I laid out the case. I didn't use legal jargon. I spoke plainly, like a commander briefing his officers before a mission. I talked about the illegal fines, the pattern of harassment targeting the vulnerable. I explained the no-bid contract awarded to Karen's brother-in-law. I showed them the numbers, how their dues and fines were being funneled into her family's pockets. I explained the concept of fiduciary duty and how Karen and her board had not just failed it, but shattered it. A murmur grew into a wave of angry conversation. People were sharing their own stories more loudly now, the pieces clicking into place. The $500 special assessment for new mulch last year suddenly made sense. The constant push to use the HOA's preferred vendors for repairs was cast in a new, sinister light. I had given their individual frustrations a name and a face. I had given them a common enemy. The annual HOA meeting is in 3 weeks, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. It's our chance to take back our community. But we have to be smart. We have to be organized. We can't just go in there yelling. We have to go in there with a plan, with evidence, and with a unified voice. By the time the barbecue ended, we had a plan. We had formed the Harbor's Crest Homeowners for Transparency. We had a strategy for the meeting. David Chen, a quiet CPA who lived on the next street, would handle the financial presentation. Maria Rodriguez would speak for the families who had been targeted. Mr. Henderson would talk about the emotional cost of the board's tyranny, and I would be the one to bring it all home. We were no longer a collection of disgruntled neighbors. We were an insurgency. The 3 weeks leading up to the annual meeting were a blur of clandestine activity. Our little insurgency communicated through a private email group, sharing information and coordinating our strategy. David Chen, the CPA, took the financial notes Eva and I had compiled and transformed them into a devastatingly simple PowerPoint presentation, using colorful charts and graphs to illustrate the flow of money from our pockets directly into the Miller family's coffers. Maria Rodriguez drafted a moving personal statement about the stress and financial hardship her family had endured. Mr. Henderson, a man of few words, simply said he would speak from the heart. My role was to be the architect of the confrontation. With Eva's guidance, we prepared a formal multi-point motion to be presented at the meeting. It called for the immediate removal of Karen Miller and the entire board of directors for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. It demanded a full, independent, forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years, and it proposed the immediate election of an interim board to oversee the transition. We also prepared packets for every homeowner who would be in attendance. Each packet contained copies of the key pieces of evidence, the meeting minutes awarding the contract to Miller's Landscape, a summary of the suspicious invoices, and a simplified explanation of the bylaws Karen had violated. We were not going to let her control the narrative or dismiss our claims as baseless accusations. We were arming the populace with facts. The night before the meeting, my phone rang. It was Lieutenant Rodriguez. Admiral, a word of warning, he said, his voice low. Karen Miller has been going door to door. She's telling people that you're a disgruntled resident trying to stage a hostile takeover of the board so you can ignore the rules. She's saying you're using your military rank to intimidate people into joining you. It was a predictable move. When the facts are against you, attack the messenger. Thank you for the intel, Lieutenant, I said. Let her. Her panic is showing. We stick to the plan. The annual meeting was held, as always, in the clubhouse. The room was packed, with more residents in attendance than had been seen in years. Our email campaign had worked. People were curious, angry, and ready for a change. Karen sat at the head table, looking flushed and supremely confident. She clearly believed her smear campaign had worked, and that this would be just another routine meeting where she would railroad her agenda through a mostly empty room. She opened the meeting with her president's report, a long, rambling speech about the importance of community standards and protecting property values. She threw in a few thinly veiled digs about newcomers who don't respect our way of life. The tension in the room was thick enough to land a helicopter on. Then came the treasurer's report. The nervous man, whose name was Barry, stood up and rushed through a high-level summary of the budget, avoiding any real detail. When he finished, Karen asked if there were any questions. This was our moment. As planned, David Chen, the CPA, stood up. He was a small, unassuming man, and Karen looked at him with bored condescension. Yes, David? Thank you, Madam President, David began, his voice calm and steady. I have a few questions regarding the line item for grounds maintenance. The budget shows an expenditure of $110,000 for the fiscal year. Could you provide a breakdown of that cost? Specifically, how much was for labor, how much for materials, and how much for administrative overhead. Barry, the treasurer, stammered, shuffling his papers. I, um, I don't have those specific details with me. That's fine, David said smoothly, because I do. He clicked a button on a remote, and a projector screen behind the board flickered to life. The first slide showed a pie chart breaking down the landscaping costs based on our analysis of the invoices. According to the invoices submitted by your sole source contractor, Miller's Lawn and Landscape, David continued, his voice gaining strength, the costs appear to be significantly inflated when compared to industry standards. For example, the invoice for seasonal mulch was for $20,000. My research indicates that for a community our size, a comparable service should cost no more than $8,000. Can you explain this $12,000 discrepancy? The room went dead silent. Karen's face went from pink to a deep, mottled red. That is an outrageous accusation, she sputtered. Miller's provides premium service. Then perhaps you can explain these invoices, David said, clicking to the next slide. It showed two separate invoices from Miller's, both for spring planting services, both dated the same day, each for $4,500. Why would the contractor split a $9,000 job into two separate invoices? Was it perhaps to keep each individual invoice under a $5,000 threshold that might require board review? Karen shot to her feet. This is out of order. We are not here to audit our valued vendors. Do you have a question about the budget report or not? My question, David said, his voice like ice, is whether the treasurer, Mr. Barry, was aware when he seconded the motion to award this contract that Miller's Lawn and Landscape is wholly owned by your brother-in-law, a fact that was never disclosed to the homeowners? A collective gasp went through the room. Barry looked like he was about to faint. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. The ambush had been sprung. The enemy was in disarray. It was time for the main assault. Before Karen could regain her footing and shut the meeting down, Maria Rodriguez stood up. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger as she spoke, filled with the quiet conviction of a mother defending her family. My name is Maria Rodriguez. My husband and I were fined over $2,000 because our children's playset was the wrong color. We were threatened with a lien on our mouth. We were told we had to use an approved vendor to build a new one. That vendor was Miller's Lawn and Landscape. She paused, letting her words sink in. We just learned tonight where that $2,000 probably went. It didn't go to improving our community. It went to a slush fund, and we were forced to pay for our own harassment. Next, Mr. Henderson rose, his posture stooped, but his voice clear as a bell. My name is George Henderson. I've lived in this community for 35 years. My wife planted the roses in my front yard before most of you were born. Last year, President Miller declared them a nuisance. She tried to fine me into submission, to force me to tear up the last living memory I have of my wife. He looked directly at Karen, his old eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound sadness. This was never about property values. This was about cruelty. It was about making a good man feel small in his own home. The personal testimonies were devastating. They transformed the abstract numbers on David's slides into real pain, real hardship. The mood in the room had shifted from angry curiosity to open rebellion. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. Karen banged her gavel on the table, her face a mask of fury. This is not a public trial. This is a private meeting. All of these issues have been handled according to the bylaws, she shrieked. You are all out of order. That was my cue. I stood up in the back of the room. The shouting slowly died down as people turned to look at me. I didn't have to raise my voice. Decades of command presence have a way of focusing a room. No, Madam President, I said, my voice cutting through the silence with chilling calm. You are the one who is out of order. You have systematically violated the bylaws you claim to uphold. You have breached your fiduciary duty to this community, and you have, through your actions, engaged in a conspiracy to defraud the very homeowners you swore an oath to serve. I began to walk slowly toward the front of the room, and as I walked, members of our group started handing out the packets of evidence we had prepared. In your hands, I announced, my voice resonating with authority, you will find the proof. You will find the meeting minutes where the board, without disclosing a clear conflict of interest, awarded an exclusive, lucrative contract to the president's own family member. You will find examples of the fraudulent invoices used to siphon money from our treasury. You will find a legal analysis, prepared by counsel, detailing the numerous state laws that have been broken. I reached the front of the room and stood before the table, looking down at Karen and her now terrified cronies. You have used your position not to serve this community, but to enrich yourself and to bully your neighbors. You have created a toxic environment of fear and intimidation, all to feed your own ego and your own wallet. Karen's face was contorted in a sneer of pure hatred. You have no right. I was elected. An election is not a coronation, I countered sharply. It does not grant you a license to commit fraud. Therefore, pursuant to Article 3, Section 4 of the Harbor's Crest Estates bylaws, which allows for the removal of a board member by a majority vote of the homeowners for cause, I hereby make the following motion. I held up the formal motion we had drafted. I move for the immediate removal of Karen Miller, Barry Stokes, and Susan Gable from the board of directors. I move for the immediate commissioning of a full independent forensic audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years. And I move for the immediate election of an interim board to manage this community until the audit is complete and new permanent elections can be held. I turned to the stunned audience. I asked for a second to my motion. A chorus of voices erupted. I second it. Second. Seconded. Karen slammed her gavel again and again, the sound lost in the uproar. This meeting is adjourned, she screamed. I will not be subjected to this kangaroo court. You can't adjourn a meeting to escape a motion that's been properly made and seconded, I stated, my voice unwavering. The bylaws are clear. We will now vote. Her meltdown was spectacular. She swept her papers off the table, her face purpled with rage. You will all be hearing from my lawyer. I'll sue every single one of you for slander. I'll put a lien on every house in this godforsaken neighborhood. Her threats were empty now, the pathetic last gasps of a tyrant whose power had evaporated in an instant. No one was afraid of her anymore. She had been exposed, her power stripped away, not by force but by the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. Mr. Henderson, acting as the elder statesman of the community, called for the vote. It was a simple show of hands. One by one, hands went up across the room, a forest of silent, unified rebellion. It was nearly unanimous. Karen Miller stared out at the sea of hands, her expression crumbling from rage to utter disbelief, and then, finally, to the pathetic, hollow look of defeat. Her reign was over. The aftermath of the vote was swift and decisive. Karen, Barry, and Susan stormed out of the clubhouse, shouting threats over their shoulders that nobody paid any attention to. In their wake, a profound sense of relief and empowerment settled over the room. We had done it. We had taken our community back. As per my motion, we immediately held an election for an interim board. Mr. Henderson was nominated by acclamation to be the new president. His quiet dignity and long-standing presence in the neighborhood made him the perfect choice to heal the divisions Karen had created. David Chen, our heroic CPA, was elected treasurer, and Maria Rodriguez was elected secretary. I was asked to serve as a member-at-large, an offer I accepted on the condition that my term would end once a permanent board was in place. My mission was to restore order, not to rule. The very next day, the interim board held its first meeting. Our first order of business was to hire an independent forensic accounting firm, the best in the state. Our second was to draft a letter to Miller's Lawn and Landscape, terminating their contract for cause, effective immediately. Our third was to send a formal notice to all homeowners, placing a moratorium on all pending fines and violations issued by the previous board until a full review could be conducted. It was like opening the windows in a house that had been sealed shut for years, letting in fresh air and sunlight. The forensic audit took 6 weeks, and the results were even more damning than we had anticipated. The auditors uncovered a systematic scheme of embezzlement totaling over $200,000 over 5 years. It included the inflated landscaping contracts, as well as personal expenses, vacations, shopping sprees, car repairs, that Karen had billed to the HOA's credit card under the guise of administrative expenses or community supplies. Barry, the treasurer, had signed off on every single one. The entire meticulously documented report was turned over to the district attorney's office. 3 weeks after that, Karen Miller, her brother-in-law, and Barry Stokes were indicted by a grand jury on charges of felony theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and embezzlement. Karen's blustering threats of lawsuits had dissolved into the quiet, humiliating reality of mugshots and bail hearings. Her reign of terror had ended not with a bang, but with the clink of handcuffs. With the legal system handling the criminals, the new board focused on rebuilding the community. We held a series of town hall meetings, not to dictate rules, but to listen. We went through the bylaws line by line, working with residents to eliminate the vague, arbitrary, and purely punitive regulations. The rule about grass height was amended to a more reasonable standard. The draconian restrictions on play sets and lawn decorations were abolished, replaced with simple guidelines based on safety and common sense. We established a transparent and fair process for handling legitimate complaints, one that focused on neighborly resolution rather than immediate fines. Most importantly, we refunded every single dollar that had been collected in illegal or unjust fines by the old board. Checks were mailed out to dozens of families, including the Rodriguezes and, of course, myself. My check included the full amount for the impound and towing fees, plus the estimated cost to repair the scratch on the hull of the Resolute. Justice, it turned out, could be itemized. One Saturday afternoon, a few months after the annual meeting, I was out in my driveway, just as I had planned to be on that first weekend. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze was blowing. I was carefully sanding the newly repaired patch on the boat's hull, the fiberglass smooth and seamless under my fingertips. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the tense, fearful silence of before. It was a peaceful quiet, punctuated by the distant sound of children laughing in the Rodriguez's backyard and the gentle clip, clip, clip of Mr. Henderson pruning his prize-winning roses across the street. He saw me and wandered over, holding 2 tall glasses of iced tea. "Thought you might be thirsty, Admiral," he said, handing one to me. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was a friend. "Thank you, Mr. President," I replied with a smile. We stood there for a moment, sipping our tea and looking at the boat. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd see the day. I figured I'd just have to put up with her until I was in the ground." "Bullies only have the power you give them, George," I said, running my hand along the boat's rail. "Sometimes it just takes one person to stand up and remind everyone else that they have a voice." He nodded, looking around at the peaceful street, at the houses that were once again homes instead of potential violations. "You did more than that, John," he said. "You gave us our neighborhood back." We stood in comfortable silence as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over harbor's crest. My mission here was complete. The boat, the Resolute, was almost ready for the water. I had kept my promise to Sarah, and in doing so, I had helped a community find its own resolve. I learned that command isn't always about a battleship or a strike group. Sometimes it's about your own front yard. It's about protecting your home, your neighbors, in the simple, decent order of things. And it's about knowing that when a petty tyrant declares war, the only acceptable response is a strategic, overwhelming, and absolute victory.